Well, first off, here, pass that over here real quick.
Oh.
Hello? Hello?
There you go, George.
Thank you. Thank you. I just had one follow-up comment. I was going to have Mike actually do this, but I decided I'll just jump in and do it. In differentiating some terms related to microbiology. And we want to make sure that everyone is grasping the concept of fecal indicator bacteria and public health risk, okay, versus specific pathogen monitoring or detection and health risk. So what we've been speaking about today, whether we're talking about E. coli, enterococci, Bacteroidetes, or these other fecal bacteria that we're talking about, those are not pathogens for the most part. Okay? Those are indicators of fecal pollution and indicators of the potential presence of pathogenic organisms, such as the parasites, Cryptosporidium, Giardia, viruses, enteric viruses in that group, and some bacteria, Salmonella, Campylobacter. Those are the leading waterborne pathogens that we're talking about, and we are not directly measuring those. There are many reasons why we don't do that, and we use this fecal indicator model to look at health risk. Epidemiological studies have been done which relate the relationship and levels of these indicator organisms and gastrointestinal illness in swimmers, essentially, people coming in contact with water, okay, and incidental ingestion of the water. We have to be very careful when we start to talk about indicator persistence and regrowth in the environment. We are not talking about the actual pathogen persistence in regrowth environment, but rather the indicators of fecal pollution. Okay? Cryptosporidium, Giardia, enteric viruses do not multiply in the environment. They require a host animal, and in most cases, humans, when we're talking about the viruses in particular. Okay? And most of the other species of Cryptosporidium and Giardia, the waterborne parasites that we're most interested in. So please keep that in mind. Okay? We did have two comments which were written down on the cards, and they're pretty broad questions, and I thought be a nice way to start some things off here. One, we heard a little bit about regulatory components of the Beach Act, and have those regulatory components been applied to inland surface waters? And I don't know if some of our regulatory people here can answer that, and I'm not positive whether or not this question had to do with the push towards molecular methods as an option for meeting the regulatory requirements for enterococci monitoring. Does anyone want to elaborate on that question, or no? Everyone's too shy. Back there, yes?
Well, I can elaborate on it because I asked the EPA that question directly, and the answer was that I had to go to the preamble and use language in the preamble to make the Beach Act applicable for inland water. So that was the EPA response to my question.
Anyone else? Yes, Jamie.
My insight on that would be the Beach Act is applicable to beach waters and Great Lakes. However, there's an overlap in that there was a litigation and a settlement agreement, and in that settlement agreement, the agency has agreed to refresh and relook at the science linking swimmer illness and indicators.
Okay.
So, and they're doing that, and the date to the court to have that report presented is October of this year.
Okay.
Now, what is a little bit poorly understood is that what the agency will do, they're not going to promulgate a rule, or they will make a recommendation saying we did all this research, we refreshed our epidemiology, and here's what we think is an appropriate regulatory structure with the type of organism, the way to measure it, the number, the upper bound, and they'll refresh their federal recommendation. Now that recommendation will be for everything.
Okay.
So it'll refresh the old 86 study.
Okay.
So that if that kind of helps you understand the relationship between, you know, the Beach Act was what stimulated litigation. Litigants said you all aren't meeting your deadlines, you're not doing what you're supposed to do. The settlement sort of says, okay, we'll do this expansive study and we'll refresh what we currently know about what makes people sick at beaches sometimes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Sally, you have anything to, would you say anything other?
I just know that there is a lot of information on the internet, and if folks, you know, want to find out more, to follow it closely, to look at all of these details, it's a very public process. In fact, a public comment period just closed.
21st.
Yeah, the 21st of this month. So, so it's a very, you know, in progress at the moment. But the trip date for the lawsuit and the settlement agreement is October this year. So something's going to come out of EPA to meet that particular.
Be enough, you know, we'll refresh our recommendation.
All right. Thank you. One of the other questions we had, actually a couple-parter here. To utilize BST to the extent recommended by the Bacterial TMDL Task Force, one of two things seem to need to happen. One, increase federal and state funding to add the BST component, or two, do fewer projects and utilize BST in them all. What direction do you see watershed planning projects taking in the future? Well, obviously we know we don't have a surplus of funds hanging around to work with, so that will certainly be a challenge. But as you might have heard, or hopefully it was an overriding theme when we were talking about source tracking methodology, is that we're looking at ways of reducing costs. For example, the Texas statewide library, and not having to go to each watershed, each project that we have and build a large, expensive E. coli library. That's one approach at reducing costs, and a very significant one too. The other one is looking at the synergy between the library methods and library independent methods, and how we can use those together to answer the needs of each of the projects that we're working on. So we are heading in that direction, and those were recommendations that came from the task force report. At this point, a comment on that, most of the research needs that were listed in the task force report, as well as our current understanding, I think even though it's several years old now, we have learned some things. We have gone down the road as far as research exploration, and we're learning more as we try and apply the methodology to case studies. You know, what you heard during this conference were some of the extreme cases. You didn't hear about all the great success stories too, which there are plenty of to talk about, believe it or not. But we also have had surprises in almost every single study that we've done. Something there was not as expected or anticipated. And that's, I think, a reality of working in the real world, you know. Okay, so does anyone else have any comments about directions? I'd like to hear back from the audience here after, you know, what you've seen in the last day and a half. We have different tiers in the task force. We don't have source tracking as a component of all of those. We do have modeling in there as well, and some basic modeling. But from what you heard, as far as the rationale behind those different steps and the requirements to move towards more costly and sophisticated and in-depth studies incorporating BST or extensive modeling, do you feel that that is really the correct path we should be taking for future studies now? Should we stick with those recommendations? Or does anyone have any other comments on that? Yes?
I come from Georgia, and I used to work for the state overseeing the MS4 permits. I now work for a county that has a
large phase 1 permit. And working with the small phase 2 stormwater permittees, none of them are going to be able to understand any of this or be able to afford any of it. And my perspective, of course, is Georgia. I think there's a component here of helping the local governments when they have to do this, because we're required in our stormwater permit to find out the source of all of our impairments, not just fecal, and get rid of them. And there's more and more pressure from EPA to do that. And so as a result, when it comes to the small guys, well, who are they going to talk to? And how are they going to figure this stuff out? And so some way for them to be able to determine how do they pick a consultant? Do they talk to the university? How do they get started? Who do they partner with? We've done a whole lot of work. This has just been a phenomenal conference from my perspective. But there's a whole group out there that could utilize this information to be able to determine how to spend their limited funds. So it's just my comment.
George, I wanted to follow up on the previous questions about maybe what we can do to maybe incorporate better the bacteria TBL task force.
I guess my question for the group is, we obviously can't do this for every single impaired segment in the state because, we're looking at over 300. But is there a scale that you would feel comfortable with, or, what are some factors that we can start? Maybe broaden the scale. We can do some studies that maybe incorporate 30 or 40, 50 segments and get some better ideas of where the sources are for a broader watershed. I guess I just want some input from the group. Would something like that be appropriate? I understand if we have a beach that's regulated at, and we've got some we probably need to focus on major efforts there. But on some of these other watersheds where we don't have those type of situations, is there a broader scale that we can apply this to and still get the data and usable data and information, but without having to do this for every single impaired segment?
Can I respond to that? Yeah. So one of the strategies that we had recommended, and this is actually in that chapter in the book that Chuck Hagedorn talked about, was we came up with a sort of a rubric for watershed assessment, and it was based on the World Health Organization's, gosh, and I can't remember the document, but do you remember?
No, I don't.
Anyway, so if you read the chapter, if you want me to send it to you, I think I can, but it was basically a rubric, and the scale went, from bad to good on a horizontal axis and a vertical axis. I don't have the figure with me, or I'd show it to you. It'd be easier to visualize. But on one axis of this scale was the extent of impairment. In other words, what is the geometric mean, for example, of fecal coliforms or E. coli or whatever you're measuring? And we had, bins into which you'd put this geometric mean for the various watersheds that you were considering exploring in more detail. And then on the other side was the risk to human health, and that was categorized by factors like any measure of true pathogens, as George talked about, that had been done. Also, the extent to which the water body was used for recreation. So if it's a little bitty tributary that somebody would just jump across, that's going to get a low score on the scale of risk to human health. But if it's a water body that people actually have full contact in, then you get a much bigger score for human health. And so that was kind of a nice way, we thought, of categorizing, okay, which water bodies do we target first for more extensive investigation? And like I said, it's in that chapter in the microbial source tracking book, and I could surely send somebody a PDF of it if they didn't want to buy that whole book. The book's also available actually in a PDF form from Springer, which is a lot cheaper than buying the whole volume. So that wasn't a plug, but that was just a, it really wasn't.
Plus you offered to give it a
She's got
free,
the royalties, yeah.
so that's pretty good.
It was kind of cool. It has lots of colors. It's informative, I thought.
Yeah, do you mind if I just wanted to address the first comment first, and then, because you had said that, so I'll offer an opinion, I'm always good for an opinion, right? How to make it usable and affordable for more widespread use, and I guess to throw out a shout out to Orrin and the work that he's trying to do. Somebody who's in regulatory authority, and the EPA and FDA are the two that have regulatory authority over these issues. If there was a way to make a standardized methodology, standardized procedures, and I know it's like herding cats, trying to get, you know, Jody can tell us about how difficult it was to get multiple high-quality researchers in the GOMA to use the same methodologies. But somebody has to have that fight.
But they finally did.
And then they finally did. And so there is precedent, and it seems to me, to get on a soapbox, that if we had a standardized methodology that may not be perfect, it may not be the end-all, but at least that would give people a basis, and it would be a hell of a lot cheaper than trying to validate new methods every time, than trying to establish a new methodology, validate that new methodology in every laboratory. Those of us who have done that in our labs recognize how very expensive and time-consuming that is.
Yeah, I'd like to add just a quick point, I'm sorry. And that is, you also have to realize that we're in the middle of these development schemes now. And the technology is not the end-all, the final result. So you need to give us a little bit of time to work this out. And it was the same for the current technology we use for collifor counting. That went through a phase of development and ended up being now this nice, neat kit that you can use and do it very easily, but it didn't start out that way. So we have a little more development time before we produce our final product. I don't know when we're going to get there, but we're all trying these different technologies. And eventually, the market will work things out so the price will drop on some of these technologies as they move forward.
But in the meantime, people are under consent decree, and they have to do something like it. So that's challenging to give you time.
I realize that.
So one idea that I have for bringing down the cost of this is to crowdsource in a targeted way the sampling and perhaps even some of the analysis. As a teacher, an educator at an undergraduate institution, I am currently I'm doing undergraduate research in annotating microbes in a crowdsourced way, and it's really effective.
What does that mean?
Oh, so what I mean by crowdsourcing is you could work with undergraduate institutions, special classes at undergraduate institutions, or even high schools as long as you have a standardized protocol, that would be really important. A standardized protocol that's easy to do. You could have them do the work of going out and collecting the samples and sending them to some place. And some of the more advanced classes, so for example, college courses or classes could easily isolate E. coli using M-type or modified M-type or whatever, and perhaps even could begin to do PCR. I know that we do PCR in college. So, so that would really bring down the cost if there was a standardized protocol. And to sweeten the deal, a lot of colleges and universities right now are trying to improve their, or increase the number of service learning courses that they're offering. This would absolutely fall in the category of service learning. And so it's clearly something the community needs. And it would, help the students to learn. So, that's the definition of service learning. And on top of that, my understanding of the Texas school curriculum plans is that AP Environmental Science is about to be required in all high schools or something like that. So they're going to be really improving or increasing their environmental education. They're going to want to have experiences to connect what students are learning in the classroom to, real life. This would be ideal. So I think there are a number of opportunities for whoever to really reduce the cost of this sort of analysis for collection, for initial analysis by taking advantage of minions.
Yes, that's a very good comment, and I think, I think one particular area that could be used to advantage in that situation would be the water sample collection. So it does take a lot of time, and there's proximity issues, and getting them to a certified lab. That's one of the problems with doing any of the downstream analysis. Besides biological hazards, for enumeration of these organisms, they need to be nationally accredited through the NELAB program, and most schools are not going to go through that effort, or the cost of the reagents and things for the rest of the analysis. But definitely for water sample collection, that is something that should be explored. I appreciate that comment. Yes?
Along the same theme, I love this idea of almost scheming. What kind of information do I have that could lend itself to these kinds of opportunities? Maybe some of the modeling data. What's the average E. coli count in possum feces? Well, that might be something that lends itself to the educational setting as well. So some of those basic questions that still need to be addressed for some of the models might be appropriate for that type of system.
I'll take that. I agree with you. We currently do that in the state of Minnesota for monitoring programs. So we get a lot of the high school and middle school students involved with monitoring programs. We supply them with MTech and other methods they can use for cheaply and inexpensively determining fecal counts in waterways, and then we kind of use that as our surveillance method because our state, I tell you, the folk just can't keep up with all the monitoring, so we do that. But to have them do PCR and other things, I think is going to be a little bit difficult for them. So what we've done now is try to establish stations throughout the state that are qualified to do the PCR and fall within the distances where the samples are delivered rapidly.
Well, but they could do more of the data exploration. So not necessarily the stuff where they're absolutely trying to figure out, where is the source of E. coli, but rather, is this set of primers a good marker for this collection of bacteria? They could do that PCR.
So currently we're doing that in round-robin studies around the United States, focused by different groups of people. And I should tell you, the variation in the data sets that we get back from all those people, and these are scientists at national universities throughout the United States, is all over the chart. So we're not quite there yet, but hopefully in the future we could get there.
I can't talk.
No, I was.
You don't mind.
It's easier for everybody to hear if you don't mind. Is that right to you guys?
Actually, I passed a microbial source in California when I was a PhD student. There is a harbor which is a lot of issues with pets, especially dogs. For the county, they approach microbial source tracking is a highly technical qPCR analysis, but also they do a public approach because the taxpayer going to be involved somehow, regulation level. So when they start project microbial source tracking, they invite taxpayer, for example, pet owner, or for example, Texas landowner, or some people have associated with those microbial source tracking, so that they have to involve somehow initial or somehow in the step. Otherwise, we found the problem in the beach. The taxpayer, they have to be some lower issue with that because it has money issue is lower. So that for microbial source tracking approach for this radiation level had to be taxpayer involved somehow. That's my comments.
Right behind you.
Just wanted to remind people that Texas has got the Texas Clean Rivers program with river authorities that are working together with TCQ, with standardized quality control, and ELAC accredited laboratories, and that may be an avenue that you may want to look at. The data that's being put on the 303D list that identifies the impairments. Typically, it's the river authorities that are picking up the majority of those samples. So we're already out there. We're already picking up samples, and we're already running the E. coli analysis.
I just want to point out before I give this back to you that everybody's been talking about collection and cost, but nobody seems dissatisfied at all by the data content and the interpretations that we're able to deliver. And I wonder if we just haven't gotten to that point yet, or is everybody really happy?
Someone's not happy.
Might well kick that hornet's nest.
1.5 hours.
Our stakeholders, river authorities, and they are step one in all of the projects that we've done in Texas today. So we rely on them very well.
I'm with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, and we did not come willingly to what is largely regarded as a human health issue. But when the initial BST studies showed implications for wildlife, we felt like we needed to get involved. Now, I haven't been to a lot of watershed protection plan meetings or TMDL meetings recently, but early on it was my observation that the BST results led to divisiveness within the stakeholder meetings rather than leading to solutions. So I would encourage whatever the technology is cool, absolutely cool. But we have to think of the goal, which is improvement in water quality, and make sure things are presented and used in such a way that it leads to solutions. And I was particularly encouraged to see Jody's talk about finding a sewage leak and using it for things like that. And so I think we have to be careful in how we use it. Finally, or two more things about solutions. I think there is a way to present this kind of information that can lead to the proverbial win-win situation. And I'll go to the Buck Creek watershed for that one. We have Parks and Wildlife has technical guidance biologists whose job is to engage with local private landowners to help them develop wildlife management plans for their properties. And there are all kinds of these programs through USDA or Parks and Wildlife or whatever. We engaged, I think it was 5 new cooperators up in the Buck Creek watershed through the watershed protection plan, the TMDL processes. That's the kind of win-win solution that we would like to see. And finally, just a pitch. Under Texas statute, feral hogs are not wildlife. It makes our life so difficult that we all lump them in with wildlife. So, another way to do that really helps us.
Wrong syntax. How about boots? Boots, is that what you said? Boots.
Potential bacon. Monitoring and the requirement for, in Texas, now you have to have a LEAC accredited lab, which restricts considerably where you're going to get samples run. It is something that you can do at a university. We had one for the last 3 years. The first time they came and audited us, we had primarily undergraduates in the lab. I had a lab manager, we had some grad students. TCQ came in, audited us the first time, we got the chemist, and it's documentation. Second time, they sent a microbiologist, and he told me, they came in for 3 days, they went through every piece of paper we have, and it's a huge amount of documentation. And he was skeptical about us doing it with the personnel we had. And he came away totally impressed and converted to, yes, you know, this can work, this work. So if you're really into it, I mean, you have to bring in a certain number of samples and run a certain number of samples for it to be cost effective, because there's costs for the accreditation, there's costs for keeping up with everything. Like I said, the documentation is incredible, but on the other side of it, for the students, all my undergrad students, they worked in the lab, we ran each month, we had 50-something stations a week, we had students going out. Any of those students get jobs in labs at the drop of a hat. They know what an SOP is. They know about every time you open a refrigerator, you have to check the temperature, and close the temperature, and close the door, and calibrate, and those kinds of things. So it can be a very good setup educational too. And you know, if there were more of them, again, that expands opportunities.
Terry had to do it too.
I agree. It's definitely an obstacle, especially for an academic lab. And if you have other projects that involve accreditation, are a real challenge.
One of the things that I would keep in mind going forward when you're working with the stakeholders, especially landowners, and I'm not a Texas resident, I'm from California, but it's one of the things that we've run in there. They haven't asked us what we need. What's going to be beneficial to us financially, what's going to be a lot of fun. Going forward, I mean, this whole conference, nobody's talking about fun here. And if you get it to a fun stage, somewhere where, and not that shooting hogs out of a helicopter wouldn't have been very appealing to me 20 years ago. Probably might even pay for it if I had money. But keep that in mind going forward. Ask the stakeholders if there's going to be some kind of financial gain instead of a regulatory hammer there. That's what's driving them. And that's kind of the way that we feel now. We feel like we're under the gun. Once you get on the 303D list, that's kind of like having that tattoo that you wish you hadn't gotten. You got to put it in front of you. You know, you get up and it's kind of like, well, what am I going to do? How am I going to erase this? And it takes quite a bit. It'd be nice to be able to go into some of these areas that aren't on the 303D list, that haven't been tested yet. And if you could get stakeholders inspired to do something ahead of time so they don't end up with that god-awful tattoo. And that's just something to keep in mind. And like I said, if you can make it fun, dang, I'm all for it.
We think we're pretty fun to work with. We have a good time.
Especially after work.
So, certainly important cost considerations there.
Try to be proactive about looking at areas that haven't been, for landlords, just talking about particularly, go into areas that aren't on the 303D list. And if the numbers are high, look at ways to mitigate before they get on that.
I think this is the first workshop I've ever been to where where you, Jody, and several of the other speakers have stressed the use of these amplification standards, DNA extraction standards. It's really outrageous how many papers get published these days without that type of control data. And I know that a lot of the top journals are now requiring that the papers adhere to these MIQE guidelines that have been published. However, not all journals have, and I'm writing a review paper on antibiotic resistance genes in the environment, and as far as I can figure, the papers I've reviewed, about 65% don't show any use of these sorts of standards. So I think that the data that you showed is extremely high quality, and I've come away rejuvenated that it's not just me.
You know, I mean, I'm always preaching. There is a grad student here that I work with who can attest to the fact that I'm always talking about standards, 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 and I think they get tired of it, but, right? But anyway, you know, high quality, kudos for me. So.
I have a follow-up comment with that too. One of the problems with QPCR methods, and there have been numerous publications evaluating these library independent methodology. There are no commercially available standards, so that causes a problem too.
I just want to follow up on another thing what Kevin started off actually. How are you going to do all this work more economically, and how we can do it scientifically and differences of manner at the same time? One of the suggestions I had, and I think we had similar work done for nutrient PMDLs in the past, where we talked about doing like some kind of a group analysis actually, of watersheds or similar things. So you can do some kind of a principal component analysis or some kind of a cluster analysis you can do of similar watersheds or similar sources of different pathogens and things like that. Where you can do a CART is very economical to work with actually, so you can do a statewide select type of process actually, just to look at all the sources and things like that. That way when you do go and collect your BST, any of the practical source tracking instruments, you'll be able to be more targeted approach in terms of where and when and how you may be able to collect some of this stuff. And we can also combine that with some of the time series analysis, because the approach, the select approach is more on potential. We can add some of the time series analysis to that to really pin down when you and what time of the year you need to go do some monitoring and what kind of samples you need for that and things of that nature. So you can gain some efficiency. If you put all your 300 TMDL on the 3035 day list in the state, you can come up with a pretty good classification of some of the dominant sources and what you need to do to go about doing that in a more effective manner. Anybody wants to comment on that or want to add on to it?
We have about 15 more minutes of panel discussion, so don't be shy. If you have questions, please ask them.
There's a lot of discussion raised about persistence of bacteria, and so Dr. Sadowski talked about some of the naturalized bacteria that could potentially be reintroduced just by regulating in the water body, back to the water column. I think Hagedorn mentioned some recovery studies that basically either 3 to 7 years after the BMP was implemented, until there was sort of a recovery or return to attainment status for the water body, whereas I guess Dr. Gentry talked about maybe 2 weeks would be persistence in some of those Edgefield runoff studies from the cattle grazing. So as the municipality responsible for implementing these BMPs, either structural or non-structural regulatory approaches and implementation plans, can you put that into perspective? And how could both, particularly from a modeling approach we're trying to plan, what would be cost-effective BMPs? How could the source tracking tools be brought into that so that we can justify these relatively expensive or hard things for stakeholders to swallow when we have to actually go to implementation?
All right, panel, I'm looking at you.
Can you paraphrase the question, because I didn't quite follow it.
Sorry, that's not unusual for me. So it's possible that we could implement a BMT, or we could do source tracking, or do some type of modeling and have an idea that this is the source of bacteria in a given watershed. And so we come up and we put this particular BMP in an implementation plan. We could implement the BMP, but then we could not see a reduction in the actual indicator bacteria concentrations for maybe up to 7 years, as we saw with Harry's situation. So how could we use, or how could we improve current modeling tools or use source tracking methods to actually be validating the BMPs that we're implementing to the stakeholders who have to bear the cost?
So we've done a good bit of work in Florida, and I usually tell people that a water body, you know, within a year, we've always seen them bounce back. So I don't know what the deal was in particular with Page Brook, but they don't usually take that long. Now, one thing that we have done though is kind of do the same thing that Chuck did, where, as you suggested, you do go back and continue to sample over time for the markers after remediation. And then you can demonstrate that they go away. So at least you know that you've accounted for that source. Now sometimes, as you suggested again, that doesn't do the trick, and then you have to go and look in more depth. And somebody, maybe it was Chuck, commented on the fact that there isn't a lot of funding available where you can explore a problem, try to fix it, and then follow up over time. And that's something that would really complete our circle, you know, and our ability. So, I mean, that's a really good point to bring up in terms of what would be on our wish list. But I did want to make the comment that in the watersheds that I'm involved with, it does not usually take that long for the situation to get better.
Yeah, I would agree with Jody, and I guess I'm a pragmatist, and when I go out and start working at some of these sites, I pick ones where the obvious problem is the one I attack first. So there's like a leaking septic system, there's a straight pipe. I had one site I was working on, there was cows standing in the middle of the stream, so I didn't need really sensitive technology at that point to figure out what was going on. I moved some cables away from the edge of the stream, and things did improve within the next year. So it doesn't take that long. I mean, yes, there is a low-level background that's still there,
yeah,
but the numbers that were huge dropped way down and really showed that things were working.
Yeah.
But then MST might be useful to validate that,
I did.
that the reason why the decline wasn't just a natural cycle, it was because of the things you did.
Exactly. It was interesting about the funding because the agency only funded me to actually fix the problem, and they didn't fund me to follow it up over the other years, and I did that work myself because my students need that as part of their publication and for their theses. So we work together to do that.
Yeah,
theses.
We do end up spending a lot of our own money, meaning, you know, whatever sort of overhead returns and things like that we get to play with on some of these projects to round them out and present you with some of the stuff that we've been telling you.
If I only got 10 minutes, let's give them a chance.
Okay. How bad would it be if I left right now?
We've got to leave in 10 minutes.
I think this question is for Mike. With your chainsaw samples that you took, were the naturalized bacteria on the surface all throughout? Like, I'm curious how much we should maybe be concerned about getting mobilized through storms, and, you know, I assume during background conditions these naturalized bacteria are making their way to the water courses, but maybe in storms, how much of that do you expect to be part of contributing fecal coliform?
Yeah, so we typically take the top 2 centimeters and look there for these microbes because that's where the organic matter is, and that's where they're going to concentrate. And in the one study we did where we had markers, we only found 19% were making their way to the waterway. And that was for this one site, and I really can't say it's going to be the same at other sites because the soil properties are so different. As we heard before from the discussion about modeling, microbes stick to soil particles fairly tightly. So it's going to depend upon the topography, the soil type, the runoff, and all that stuff. But they will definitely be in the upper area where the organic matter is, because that's what they're feeding on.
One other question from the audience here, I wanted to make sure, it actually is a very important question, we haven't discussed it yet. Once a BST study has been completed, if we find that by far all, but majority of the E. coli or impairment might be due to wildlife sources, is there a possibility that the stream segment can be delisted, or basically how is it managed at that point? And I was hoping to, I know what has happened in a few other states, but I was hoping maybe we could get some comments. Pat, I know you've got good comments about that one too. But, from any of our regulatory people, just silence. That's it.
Nobody wants to deal with it.
I know they won't do it in Florida.
They won't do it in Minnesota either.
No, because they don't, you know, there are pathogens associated with wildlife.
Yeah, right.
So, yeah, because there are pathogens associated with wildlife species, and you can't demonstrate that we don't really know the relative risk of that fecal contamination. It's kind of like, well, we don't have enough information to make that leap. That's what Florida says. And it's true, we do need more information on pathogen loads in
If we can practice on undergrads and prisoners again. Make
this so much easier.
I can't remember where, but somewhere I was in a conversation where the state was considering another category of unattainable. And they said, well, yeah, so is that, can somebody else flesh that in? I know it exists, that cannot attain that this designated use is the designated use.
I know there's something out there because I've read some too, and I know there are a couple cases that have made it into the media with regards to birds as significant sources of fecal bacteria, and basically they look the other way. I know that has happened. I can find the specific example at some point. Maybe we can put them up on the conference website with documents there.
There's a process there that would allow that, but whether or not the state or other groups would be willing to do that is probably the big question. But there's supposed to be a process for that.
Yes. So the wildlife pathogens that Jody was talking about, are those, can those be transferred from animal to human?
So,
some of the non-pathogens?
Yeah, so they'd be considered zoonotic pathogens, transmissible from animals to humans, and particularly large sources of Campylobacter and Salmonella bacteria.
And then some of the parasites that
Yeah.
Unfortunately, Dr. Steckel, Dr. Harwood are going to have to leave here in a minute, so if you have a question, get one in for them.
Well, mine's more of a comment. Obviously, scatology's gone a long way since the Pharaoh's poop was looked at, But as a stakeholder, when I came here, is okay. I have to do, and I demonstrate to the children when I do tours. Says I got to make the water fishable swimmable. Show them our water before and after. They go, hey, I want to fish and swim on that one. And I've seen some of the stakeholders I didn't even think about. Wildlife parks, they're stakeholders, and we got ones in our place. Us, we're invested by virtue of the debate dates and things like that, but landowners, they're not really invested that much, so there's going to be a lot of resistance, and they're being taxpayers, and the cost benefit is not there, I don't see for them. So it's going to be ugly. So we're going to approach them a whole lot differently.
Yeah, and that is true. In some cases, there have been significant challenges in some of the projects like that. I know that the projects that we've done with the State Soil and Water Conservation Board, the local people that really go out and talk to the stakeholders and get their involvement in the projects, those seem to be much more palatable to people, those landowners in particular. But obviously something has to be done. That's the law. We have to look at these impaired water bodies, and it's trying to make sure everyone is happy with the end result.
I've been fortunate enough to be able to go to a couple of stakeholder meetings. And I do mean that as fortunate and not sarcastic. I think if you involve the stakeholders, landowners, very early, I think if you get their input, get their eyes on the ground, get their concerns at the beginning, and I think if you can set up and explain, all right, when we get the results, this is what it's going to look like, this is what we can and cannot do at the beginning to sort of set their expectations, then we find that a lot more of a partner than an adversary. The other thing is speaking to some of these landowners, ranchers. They do have a very vested interest in their land. They have been doing this for generations. In a way, they are very much more connected to the land than us city folk from the cities trying to do these studies. So I think if we can respect these attitudes and understand that and see that we do have common ground, then and work from there, then we get a lot more cooperation, and they know what to expect from us, we know what to expect from them, and it's a little easier.
All right. One more
I'm
question
an optimistic,
Back in
naive
that
city
corner
girl.
there, George.
There we go.
We'll have one more question and then we'll end our formal discussion. And I'm sure some of you folks might want to speak for those comments later.
This may be perhaps a request. Is Sally still here? About the wildlife and acknowledging that there is possibility of transmission from animals, disease from animals to humans. I cannot conceive how one would do the epidemiology on that to actually decide or determine, estimate what the risk is. So just as there have been national estimates of risks to swimmers and things like that, I'm going to kick this one to EPA and say, come out with some means of estimating it that we can use nationally and adapt for our situations. Because I know it's a very strong position of our department that we have birding sites, we have wildlife management areas. That's we decided a good use of state money, and there are bacteria issues in some of those, but we still want to have birding sites. We all like migratory birds, and so there has to be a way that's approvable by EPA to address this. So I think it would be great to handle it as a national question.
Sadly, follow if she wants, but I can tell you that the molecular typing methodology, science is there. It is actually a very easy question to answer, but it also is very expensive. The epidemiological studies that are now looking at the risk from water exposure typically do not identify the causative agents of the illness in the studies. So it can be done. It's very expensive, but it is possible.
Just really quick, when y'all were talking about the attainment levels, I don't know if this is what you were talking about, but TCEQ has proposed that we have different contact recreation tiers, and that might be a way to address the wildlife issues too. I don't know if you
So looking at different levels for recreational use and the risks associated with that. So that's important, and that's to be decided still. Okay. All right. Well, I think we're going to call it there. It's about 20 minutes after 12, so we're a little past the end of the scheduled final part of our lovely workshop. I would like to first acknowledge the folks. Unfortunately, Brian Vandelis had to leave, but Courtney back there, wave your hand. She was